Vader all right, but that's the start, of course, but beyond that." He changed the subject. Perhaps only I knew of his dream about a stronghold for rebels far in these mountains. He smiled. "I guess you get used to calculated risks. Except for imagination, you're as safe walking a ledge 20 stories up as down on the sidewalk." "Not if you trip." "That's the calculated risk. If you climb it, you get used to it." "Well, how did you get used to it? Were you a mountaineer or an acrobat?" "In a way, both." Clyde smiled again, a trifle bitterly, and switched the topic. "Anyway, I've been in action for the duration except for some time in hospital." Ferd was on to that boner like an infielder. To get into SC, you have to be not only championship fit, but have no history of injury that could crop up to haywire you in a pinch. "So, hospital, you sure don't show it now." Clyde was certainly below par. To cover his slip, he backed into a bigger, if less obvious one. "Oh, I was in that Operation Armada at Golden Gate. Had to be patched up." He must have figured Ferd had been a kid then, and I hadn't been too old. Odds were we'd recall the episode and no more. Unfortunately, I'd been a ham operator and I'd been in the corps that beamed those fire ships onto the invader supply fleet in the dense fog. The whole episode was burned into my brain. It had been kamikaze stuff, though there'd been a theoretical chance of the 30 men escaping to justify sending them out. Actually, one escape boat did get back with 3 men. I'd learned about those men out of morbid, conscience-scalded curiosity. Their leader was Edwin Scott, a medical student. At the very start, he'd been shot through the lower spine. So his companions put him in the escape boat while they clinched their prey. But as the escape boat sheared off, the blast of enemy fire killed 3 and disabled 2. Scott must have been some boy. He'd already doctored himself with hemostatics and local anesthetics, but from the hips down he was dead as salt pork, and his visceral reflexes must have been reacting like a worm cut with a hoe. Yet somehow he doctored the 2 others and got that boat home. The other 2 had died, but Scott lived as sole survivor of Operation Armada. And he hadn't been a big bronze Latin Indian with incongruous hazel eyes, but a snub-nosed redhead. And he'd been wheelchaired for life. They'd patched him up, decorated him, sent him to a base hospital in Wisconsin where he could live in whatever comfort was available. So he dropped out of sight. And now this? Clyde was lying, of course. He'd picked the episode at random, except that so much else about him didn't square, including his name compared to his physique, now I thought about it. I tabled it during our odyssey home, but during post-mission leave it kept bothering me. I checked and came up with what I'd already known. Scott had been sole survivor, and the others were certified dead. But about Scott I got a runaround. He'd apparently vanished. Oh, they'd check for me, but that could take years, which didn't lull my curiosity any. Into Clyde's past I was sworn not to pry. We were training for our next assignment when word came through of the surrender at Kelowna. It was a flare of sunlight through a black sky. The end was suddenly close. Clyde and I were in Victoria, British Columbia. Not subscribing to the folkway that prescribes seasick intoxication as an expression of joy, we did the town with discrimination. At midnight, we found ourselves strolling along the waterfront in that fine Vancouver Island mist, with just enough drink taken to be moving through a dream. At one point, we leaned on a rail to watch the mainland lights twinkling dimly like the hope of a new world, blackout being lifted. Suddenly, Clyde said, "What's fraying you recently, Will? When we were taking our ICEG reconditioning, it came through strong as garlic, though you wouldn't notice it normally." Why be coy about an opening like that? "Clyde, what do you know about Edwin Scott?" That let him spin any yarn he chose, if he chose. He did the cigarette lighting routine and said quietly, "Well, I was Edwin Scott, Will. Then, as I waited, yes, really me, the real me talking to you. This, he held out a powerful coppery hand, once belonged to a man called Marco da Sanhao. You've heard of transplanting limbs? I had, but this man was no transplant job, and if a spinal cord is cut, transplanting legs from Ipolovsky, the primo ballerino, is worthless. I said, what about it? I was the first successful brain transplant in man. For a moment it queered me, but only a moment. Hell, you read in fairy tales and fantasy magazines about one man's mind in another man's body, and it's marvelous, not horrible. But by curiosity, I know a bit about such things. A big surgery journal back in the 40s had published a visionary article on grafting a whole limb with colored plates as if for a real procedure. Footnote: Hall, Whole Upper Extremity Transplant for Human Beings, Annals of Surgery, 1944, page 120, paragraph 12. Then they developed techniques for acclimating a graft to the host's serum so it would not react as a foreign body. First, they'd transplanted hunks of ear and such. Then in the 60s, fingers, feet, and whole arms, in fact. But a brain is another story. A cut nerve can grow together. Every fiber has an insulating sheath which survives the cut and guides growing stumps back to their stations. In the brain and spinal cord, no sheaths. Growing fibers have about the chance of restoring contact that you'd have of traversing the Amazon jungle on foot without a map. I said so. I know, he said. I learned all I could, and as near as I can put it, it's like this. When you cut your finger, it can heal in two ways. Usually it bleeds, scabs, and skin grows under the scab, taking a week or so. But if you align the edges exactly, at once, they may join almost immediately, healing by first intent. Likewise, in the brain, if they line up cut nerve fibers before the cut-off bit degenerates, it'll join up with the stump. So, take a serum-conditioned brain and fit it to the stem of another brain so that the big fiber bundles are properly fitted together fast enough, and you can get better than 90% recovery. Sure, I said, parading my own knowledge, but what about injury to the masses of nerve cells? And you'd have to shear off the nerves growing out of the brain. There's always a way, Willie. There's a place in the brainstem called the isthmus. No cell masses, just bundles of fiber running up and down. Almost all the nerves come off below that point, and the few that don't can be spliced together, except the smell nerves and optic nerve. Ever notice I can't smell, Willie? And they transplanted my eyes with the brain. Biggest trick of the whole job. It figured, but I'd still hate to go through with it. What could I lose? Some paraplegics seem to live a fuller life than ever. Me, I was going mad. And I'd seen the dogs this research team at my hospital was working on. Old dogs' brains in whelps' bodies. Spry as natural. Then came the chance. Da Sanhao was a Brazilian wrestler, stranded here by the war. Not his war, he said, but he did have the decency to volunteer as medical orderly. But he got conscripted by a bomb that took off a corner of the hospital and one off his head. They got him into chemical stasis quicker than it had ever been done before, but he was dead as a human being, no brain worth salvaging above the isthmus, so the big guns at the hospital saw a chance to try their game on human material. Superb body and lower nervous system in ideal condition, waiting for a brain. Only, whose? Naturally, some big shot's near the end of his rope and willing to gamble. But I decided it would be a forgotten little shot, name of Edwin Scott. I already knew the surgeons from being a guinea pig on ICEG. Of course, when I sounded them out, they gave me a kindly brush off. The matter was out of their hands. However, I knew whose hands it was in, and I waited for my chance. A big job that